Most people picture medieval food in one of two ways. Either the grand feasts of castles, roasted meats, bread piled high, goblets of wine, or the opposite extreme, starving peasants surviving on almost nothing. Both images miss an important reality. For most medieval people, survival did not depend on dramatic scarcity. It depended on quiet ingenuity. Peasant communities developed dozens of simple meals built from the cheapest ingredients available: grain scraps, wild plants, fermented vegetables, bones boiled long after the meat was gone. These foods were not designed for comfort, they were designed for endurance. They kept people alive through failed harvests, long winters, and years when taxes took most of what farmers produced. This matters more than it seems, because medieval survival was less about suffering and more about systems, small, repeatable strategies that stretched limited resources as far as possible. And, many of those strategies still carry lessons today. If you're new to Iron Age Instincts, consider subscribing. This channel looks at the overlooked realities of history, how ordinary people adapted, endured, and survived under difficult conditions. And before we begin, share in the comments where you're watching from. It's always interesting to see how far these conversations travel. Now let's look closely at the foods that quietly sustained medieval Europe. The first and most common survival food was pottage, a meal that rarely looked the same twice. If one dish defined medieval peasant life, it was pottage, not bread, not meat, pottage. It was a thick stew made by boiling whatever ingredients were available in a pot over the hearth: barley, oats, peas, beans, onions, cabbage, and sometimes scraps of meat or bone. The pot often remained over the fire for days. New ingredients were added as they appeared. Old broth was rarely discarded. This detail is often overlooked. The pot itself functioned almost like a continuous food system. Each day's meal blended into the next. One English manor record from the 13th century describes farm labourers eating pottage morning and night during harvest season. The ingredients changed depending on what fields were being worked nearby. Turnips one week, leeks the next, sometimes only barley and herbs. The consistency varied, but the principle stayed the same: maximum nutrition from minimal ingredients. Coarse bread filled stomachs when little else was available. Medieval bread was not the white loaf modern people recognize. Peasant bread was dense, dark, and often made from mixed grains: rye, barley, oats, and occasionally wheat when available. The flour itself contained bran and husk fragments. Because milling technology was limited, nothing was wasted. This bread was heavy, sometimes almost sour, but it lasted, and it provided slow-burning calories needed for physical labor. There's a record from a 14th century agricultural account showing a farm worker's daily ration: 2 loaves weighing roughly 1 pound each. Bread was not a side dish, it was the meal. Simple grain porridge provided warmth and energy during cold months. Porridge was one of the most reliable foods during winter. Grain, usually oats or barley, was boiled slowly in water until it thickened. Sometimes milk was added if a family kept cows or goats. More often it was simply water and grain. But warm food mattered in cold climates, especially when homes were poorly insulated and winter days were spent outdoors working fields or tending animals. A bowl of porridge in the early morning provided enough energy to begin a day's labor. It was simple, but dependable. Peas and beans formed the backbone of medieval protein. Protein was difficult to obtain consistently without livestock, but legumes filled the gap. Peas, broad beans, and lentils were hardy crops that grew well even in poor soil. They stored well after drying and could last through winter. Pea stew was common across much of Europe, thick, green. sometimes nearly solid after cooling, but nutritionally valuable. Peas contain protein, fiber, and calories, everything needed to support long hours of physical work. This is where things begin to shift in understanding medieval diets. Peasants were not always starving. Many simply lived on foods modern diets ignore. Onion and leek soups appeared constantly in peasant cooking. Onions and leeks were among the easiest vegetables to grow. They required little space and survived cold weather better than many crops. As a result, they appear constantly in medieval food records. A simple onion broth might contain little more than sliced onions, simmered in water with a small amount of fat. But onions carried flavor, nutrients, and natural sugars that made otherwise bland meals more satisfying. Even the poorest households could grow them. That reliability mattered. Cabbage stews quietly sustained entire regions. Cabbage rarely appears in romantic images of medieval life, but historically it was essential. Cabbage grows well in cold climates, it produces large yields, and it stores for long periods. Medieval peasants often shredded cabbage into stews or boiled it with grains. The result was filling, inexpensive, and nutritionally useful. A German farming account from the 1400s even described cabbage as winter bread, a phrase meant to emphasize its importance during food shortages. This detail is often overlooked. Vegetables were survival infrastructure. Fermented vegetables allowed food to last through harsh winters. Long before refrigeration, fermentation preserved vegetables. Cabbage became sauerkraut. Turnips and carrots were fermented in brine. These foods lasted months. They also provided something critical, vitamin C. Though medieval people did not understand vitamins scientifically, they recognized that certain preserved foods helped prevent sickness during winter. Fermentation was not simply tradition. It was practical survival knowledge. Bone broth stretched every animal resource as far as possible. Meat was rare for many peasants. Livestock were too valuable to slaughter frequently. But when animals were butchered, nothing went to waste. Bones were boiled for hours, sometimes days. This created broth rich in minerals and fat. Vegetables or grains could then be added, turning a small amount of meat residue into a large pot of food. A single chicken carcass might flavor several meals. This matters more than it seems. The ability to stretch resources often determined whether a household survived a poor harvest. Cheese and curds provided concentrated nutrition. Milk spoiled quickly without refrigeration. But peasants solved this problem through cheese-making. Soft cheeses, curds, and simple farmer's cheese were common. They required minimal equipment, and they preserved protein and fat for longer periods. Sheep and goat milk cheeses appear frequently in monastery records because monks often purchased them from nearby villages. For peasant households, cheese was portable nutrition, easy to carry into fields, easy to store. Rye pancakes or flatbreads offered a quick meal during busy harvest days. Harvest season demanded long hours in the fields. Cooking elaborate meals was impossible, so quick foods emerged. Rye batter mixed with water could be poured onto a hot surface to form thin pancakes or flatbreads. They cooked quickly, and they could be eaten with onions, curds, or leftover stew. Practicality always guided medieval cooking. Boiled turnips filled the gap when grain stores ran low. Turnips were often considered poor people's food, but they grew quickly and could survive in cold soil. During difficult seasons, families boiled turnips whole or sliced them into stews. They were not particularly flavorful, but they were filling, and they kept hunger away. A small detail, yet historically significant. Many famine accounts mention turnips as the final crop available before true starvation began. Oatcakes became a staple in colder northern regions. In Scotland and northern England, oats thrived where wheat struggled, so people adapted. Oatmeal mixed with water could be shaped into thin cakes and cooked on a hot stone or griddle. These oatcakes stored well and travelled easily. Shepherds often carried them while tending flocks across hills. They were dense, dry, and long-lasting. perfect survival food. Wild herbs and greens quietly expanded the medieval diet. Not all food came from fields. Many peasants gathered wild plants, nettles, sorrel, dandelion leaves. Young nettles, in particular, were commonly boiled into soups. Once cooked, they lost their sting and provided iron and vitamins. This is where traditional knowledge becomes important. Knowing which plants were edible and when to harvest them was passed through generations. For rural communities, the surrounding landscape functioned as an extension of the pantry. Garlic broth was valued for both flavor and health. Garlic appeared frequently in medieval recipes, but not only for taste. Many believed garlic strengthened the body and protected against illness. A simple garlic broth might contain crushed cloves simmered in water with herbs and a small amount of fat. It was cheap, strong-tasting, and widely consumed. In several regions, laborers ate garlic daily during heavy agricultural work. Barley gruel offered one of the cheapest meals possible. Barley was durable and easy to grow. It could be cooked into thick gruel using little more than water. Gruel was often associated with poverty, but it served an important role. It transformed small quantities of grain into filling meals. A bowl of barley gruel might not be exciting, but it delivered calories and hydration at the same time. For workers in the fields, that mattered. Leftover bread often became simple bread soups. Stale bread was never wasted. Instead, it was soaked in hot water or broth to soften it. Sometimes onions, herbs, or cheese were added. The result was bread soup, a humble dish, but efficient. It transformed leftovers into a new meal without wasting valuable grain. This detail reflects something broader about medieval survival. Efficiency was built into daily life. Salted fish provided rare protein far from the sea. Even inland villages sometimes consumed fish, not fresh fish, salted fish. Large quantities of salted herring and cod were traded across Europe, particularly during the later medieval period. These fish could last months. A small portion added to stew or porridge provided flavor and protein. Trade networks quietly expanded survival options for rural communities. Thin ale accompanied meals more often than water. Water sources were not always safe. So many peasants drank small beer or ale with very low alcohol content. This drink was brewed from leftover grain after stronger beer was produced. It provided hydration and some calories. Children drank it, laborers drank it, and it often accompanied meals like bread and pottage. Ale was less about intoxication and more about safe hydration. Roasted apples or stewed fruit offered rare sweetness. Fruit trees were common in many villages. Apples, pears, and plums could be eaten fresh during harvest seasons, but damaged fruit often became stewed desserts, cooked slowly with a little honey when available. For people whose diets were mostly savory grains and vegetables, these small moments of sweetness mattered. They were rare, but memorable. Small amounts of lard or animal fat changed everything. Fat was precious. Even a small spoonful of lard could transform a meal. Fat added calories, flavor, and satiety. When peasants slaughtered pigs in autumn, the rendered fat was stored carefully and used sparingly throughout the year. A thin onion soup could suddenly become satisfying with a little fat added. This detail is often overlooked in discussions of historical diets. Calories mattered as much as ingredients. Sometimes survival simply meant eating less until the next harvest. Not every year produced enough food. During poor harvests, meals shrank. Pottage became thinner. Bread loaves became smaller. Families rationed what remained. A 14th-century English chronicler described one village where people stretched grain supplies by mixing flour with ground acorns and wild seeds. It was not ideal, but it kept them alive. This quiet resilience defined peasant life. Medieval peasants did not survive because their lives were easy. They survived because their food systems were practical, adaptable, and deeply rooted in local knowledge. Simple meals, but effective ones. And perhaps this raises a useful question worth thinking about today. If modern supply chains failed tomorrow, How many of us would recognize the plants, grains, and preservation methods needed to feed ourselves the way medieval communities once did? History does not always offer comfort, but it often offers perspective. These meals remind us that survival rarely depends on luxury or abundance. More often, it depends on knowledge, preparation, and the quiet discipline of using every available resource. Remembering that matters, because the past is not only a record of what happened, it is also a guide to what humans are capable of enduring. If you value this kind of deeper historical analysis, consider subscribing to Iron Age Instincts. And if this story offered a useful perspective, share the video with someone who appreciates the overlooked lessons hidden inside everyday history.